right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the forest supervisor on the Bighorn National Forest up in north central Wyoming. And I just was telling Matt that he and Dan are a really tough act to follow, and I'll give it a try. So if you don't know where the Bighorn National Forest is, it's in north central Wyoming. We're about 1.1 million acres, and it's a distinct chain separate from the rest of the Rocky Mountains. And part of the Rocky Mountains, we're a little bit of a geologic oddity, but while remote, we're not isolated from the same issues that we've spent a lot of time talking about today. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we've had going for the last few years that are really targeted towards enhancing water quality and protecting municipal watersheds. First, let me give you a caveat. I'm not a silviculturist, not a hydrologist, not even a forester. So I might not be able to answer some technical hydro questions or things like that. But what I can do is talk to you about what worked about these projects and what lessons we had, what we learned as we worked through these to try to get some good works done on the landscape. So on the map on the right, there's two blobs on that map. The northern one, that's the municipal watershed for the city of Sheridan, Wyoming. And the one down below is the watershed for the city of Buffalo, Wyoming. So I'm biased. I like it up there, but the Bighorn is pretty beautiful, pretty phenomenal landscape. Perhaps our isolation helped us avoid the widespread impacts of the mountain pied beetle epidemic. It really didn't hit the Bighorn, whether that was a factor of our isolation, a factor of unique genetics in lodgepole or ponderosa on the forest, who knows? But the fact of the matter is we were largely spared from the pine beetle epidemic. So the forest is still largely green. It's a lodgepole dominant ecosystem, but interspersed with lots of large meadow systems and wet meadow systems that generate really good high quality water, which serves our communities. But a key issue to note down there on the bottom is 56% of the forest is an inventoried roadless. And so that was a question that came up earlier this morning that I'll circle back to a couple times as we talk this afternoon. So while we have not seen the large scale wildfires and examples that were discussed today, fires here in Colorado, I was down here for the Grizzly Creek fire and unfortunately got to see some of that firsthand, or the large wildfires in California. The Bighorn has been largely spared from that sort of fire activity, though we do have a historic fire regime of fires in the 10 to 20,000 acre range is normal. And over the years, those fires have at times impacted our municipal watersheds. What you see up there is I gotta move the slide. There we go. All right. So what you see are the intake structures for the city of Buffalo's water supply and the city of Sheridan. Similar looking structures, both of which are on the national forest. And wildfires impacted the city of Buffalo in 78, 88, and 2014. And we're really kind of a wake up call for the city and for us that there was a need for change. We need to figure out what the relative risk of those was to that infrastructure and to those watersheds, so that we didn't end up with scenarios like that, which on the left, that's the Mullen fire from the Medicine Bow route, and the one on the right is the Crater Ridge fire from on the Bighorn last summer. And so first, the Buffalo Municipal Watershed Project, which we call BMW, it's a lot easier, a little simpler. We initiated that project in 2017, and it wasn't really the Forest Service at the forefront. It was a collaboration between the city, Johnson County, the Wyoming Water Development Office, and others to take a good hard look at the Clear Creek watershed, which provides the drinking water for a city of around 4,500 people. 95% of that watershed and that water supply is located on national forest. Also in the center of that right here is the Tyhack Reservoir, which is the city of Buffalo's storage reservoir. 38,000 acre project area, clearly at pretty high risk of impact. And if you think about, we talk about impacts to the Front Range, the city of Denver, and to all those millions of folks' water supply. Think of the level of effect it would have for a wildfire to do $100 million worth of damage to a city of 4,500 people's water supply. They simply can't absorb that impact on that small of a tax base. So next, the Sheridan Municipal Watershed, again, a little bit further north. These projects were sequential. I'm going to talk about them kind of together because they are very, very similar. So this one we initiated in 2019. The Sheridan Municipal Watershed is serves a community of around 20,000 people, which is really big for Wyoming. as Jim Nyman knows, but small for the rest of the world. City relies on the Big Goose Watershed for its drinking water. Again, also more than 95% of that watershed's on public lands, multiple storage reservoirs across that watershed, which are really important recreation assets to the forest and to the communities. So a little bit bigger project area, again, about 77,000 acres. So initially what our approach was is we had recognized that there was a problem out there on the landscape, and so did our municipalities. But we didn't know exactly what specifically that risk was, where it was in the landscape, what timber stands, what soil types, what drainages. And those were questions that we knew in the forest that we couldn't answer alone. So we approached this project collaboratively from the start. This was not the kind of traditional Forest Service effort where we decided what the issue was. We created a solution to that problem, and then we said, what do you think? We didn't have the resources of this very small national forest with a small staff to really grasp and do the work that it would take to really assess what the relative risk was to this watershed and what we needed to do there. So again, these projects were born collaboratively. We got funding from the Wyoming Water Development Office and the governor's office to initiate some contracted wildfire hazard risk assessments. Those assessments were guided by the forest, the state Wyoming State Forestry Division, and of course the cities and their municipalities. We did the Buffalo one first and then followed that up with the Sheridan watershed. The goal of those assessments were, one, to assess what is the risk, but also come up with a plan for how we could enhance and maintain water quality across those watersheds. So with shared risks, we need to find shared solutions. These are, again, small rural communities, a small national forest, limited staff, limited capacity, financially and in human capacity to take on a challenge of this sort of magnitude. So we recognize that need for mutual expertise, relationships, and funding, and leverage to all of those to kind of move this along and make some progress. So this is an example of what those watershed hazard assessments looked like for us. That map is the Sheridan Municipal Watershed one. You can see in that mix of color schemes, that top corner, the northeast corner of the map, which is the bottom of the drainage, there's where your highest risk relied. And where the deepest red is, you can see it, I think it's number 206. That's where the city's intake is. Steep country, heavily timbered, at high risk. And those other blobs spread across the landscape down here, here, those are where the storage reservoirs were, all of them at high risk. And so this is a composite risk matrix by drainage. That's what you're looking at there. So this takes into account forest health conditions, fuel loading, fire behavior modeling, soils and geomorphology data, debris flow and sediment delivery potential, considers all sorts of, all of those risks. It also takes into account inventoried roadless, wilderness, areas with difficult access, and then sediment trade-offs. One of the things that we knew going into this project, thanks to our work with the Water Development Office, was that if we were going to disturb, more than roughly 15% of the landscape with treatments, which might make sense to reduce the risk, that in and of itself would increase sediment delivery, and we'd be, we'd shooting ourselves in the foot. If we were treating too much of the landscape, we wouldn't be resolving the risk and getting as much done as we needed to. So some examples of the data in there. You have fire line intensity, crown fire activity, burn severity, all of things that we were using to get a grasp of what we needed to treat, where we needed to treat it, and how. So that led to 2 separate NEPA decisions. Again, the collaboration didn't end with assessing what that risk was. We continued that pattern. Our biologists on the interdisciplinary team, for example, were Wyoming Game and Fish employees, not Forest Service. We had one of the ID teams was led by a Wyoming State Forestry employee. We did the analysis collaboratively. Each assessment took roughly a year to complete. So we'll talk a little bit about, as I move on, about size and scale. These are relatively small projects, and we talk a lot these days when we talk about the wildfire crisis about increasing the pace and scale. Well, you can increase the pace and scale. It doesn't necessarily mean to have a gigantic project area, because that might not be as quick as addressing a risk quickly through a targeted assessment, which both of these were. So some examples of the treatments we proposed and have now implemented on the Buffalo watershed, and we start implementation in Sheridan next summer. So the mix of timber harvest and thinning, Jim will be pleased. One of the purpose and need for the project was to generate timber for our local timber economy. So our target for the timber work was really increase that diversity of those stands and reduce the density, trying to create some resilience for and resistance to wildfire, and also to continue to resist insect and disease impacts, which we've been successful with so far. So on the Buffalo project, that was about 1,900 acres of harvest strategically placed as a catcher's mitt for fire if it started in the wilderness to come out, and targeted those stands that were at the highest risk. 1,200 acres of which were clear cuts. Again, carefully considered, carefully placed to mimic the effects of natural wildfire, reduce the risk of sedimentation, but accomplish our goals. Sheridan Municipal Watershed project, larger acreage, larger scale, 4,000 acres of timber harvest, 9,000 acres of thinning. So of course, with that thinning, we need to burn. On the BMW project, that was up to 3,000 acres of thinning and burning. The photo there on the right is a good example of how we approach this work. We rarely get good burn windows on the Bighorn. Often when we have the right conditions where the stands we need to treat are going to be receptive to fire, they're a little too receptive, and the neighboring stands are as well. And so we have had traditionally pretty narrow idea of what a burn window looked like. Through this project, we took a different approach to that. We matched timber and thinning units with burn units and did them sequentially. So to reduce the risk of a fire escaping from the stands we couldn't treat with timber that we wanted to treat with fire, we treated them with timber around those, timber harvest around them. We also targeted south-facing slopes with lower canopy covers, more open country where we could manage the intensity of fire, so that we knew we couldn't burn the north-facing slopes because the intensities would be too high. Well, we'll reduce the risk of fire getting there by treating the other side. We also wrote our prescriptions differently so we would have more flexibility on time of year. The burn on the right was December. We've had a very low snow year on the Bighorn. With those broadly written prescribed fire prescriptions, we were able to treat some units by drone-based ignition in mid-December before we had too much snow on the landscape. But when we had just enough on the north-facing slopes, we didn't need to prep any of those units. Similar approach in the Sheridan Municipal Watershed, just without the fire component, and I'll talk about why shortly, but 9,000 acres of thinning up there, an extensive thinning. Almost all of that 9,000 acres of thinning was in inventoried roadless. So another key component of this work is, of course, enhancing water quality and reducing sedimentation. We've approached that a couple different ways. Again, in partnership with those key players who helped us to craft this work, and that's the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. So what you see behind you, those are beaver dam analogs. We needed ways to slow water down as it moved across the landscape to catch sediment if we had sedimentation increase from wildfires. And so on a number of locations in both project areas, we're building beaver dam analogs, largely with volunteers, community volunteers doing that work, RMEF funded. We also did a significant amount of aspen restoration work. That would be entering those aspen stands to reduce conifer encroachment, and use the slash generated by that to protect the young aspen seedlings from browse from wildlife and from cattle. That's been a particularly successful component so far. So we get to the roadless piece. This is where this work gets difficult. With an example in the Sheridan Municipal Watershed project, 63% of that project area is in inventoried roadless. That's 48,900 acres of that project area. But we were still able to treat about 9,000 acres. And that's through really maximizing our use of the exemptions that exist in the roadless rule. Unlike Colorado, Wyoming does not have a state roadless rule. So we operate under the National Roadless Area Conservation Rule. So we look to maximize the use of those exemptions, which allow us to do timber harvest and more importantly, a lot of mechanical thinning when that action is a benefit and it improves and protects roadless characteristics. And one way to think about that is if we did not act in those 9,000 acres of roadless, the likely outcome would be a wildfire that removed that canopy cover, destroyed those stands, reduced the ability to that landscape to provide high quality drinking water for the communities. And really the whole purpose of those being protected as roadless would be gone. So we maximize the use of those exemptions. We use a lot of mechanical thinning, but also straight timber harvest, 300 acres of that, 500 acres aspen restoration and beyond. but we can't target all of it. It's, while the challenge of treating in roadless exists, we use the exemptions to the best of our ability, but we still have some residual risk left on the landscape. So on the left, that's that same map I showed earlier. That's the composite risk matrix before treatment for the Sheridan Municipal Watershed project. And on the right is what it will look like post-treatment. Again, we're just starting implementation of that when the decision was signed last year. So you can see the areas around the watersheds and the catchment basins for those reservoirs. We've significantly reduced the risk and hazard to those and increased that ability of that watershed to continue to catch sediment and be more resilient to wildfire. We've done the best we can in this northeast part of the project area. There we have probably the most of the roadless is there. It's also really kind of steep terrain, particularly where the city's intake is. But again, we've reduced the risk overall pretty significantly. And then the follow-on treatment to that, which we're analyzing now, is more use of prescribed fire across that landscape. And why did we separate out that in that decision? That's again about increasing that pace and scale. We knew that the relative risk across those stands was high. The prescribed fire treatments we need to use in these stands are not like the ones in that Buffalo project, which were largely burning sagebrush or sparsely timbered south-facing slopes, relatively small burns, 1,000 acres or so at a time. The burns that we need to perform on the Sheridan watershed are much larger, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 acres at a time in dense lodgepole stands. It's the kind of fire that's of an intensity that our communities haven't seen before. It's also the kind that is hard to manage and capture. So we needed to take a more deliberate and careful approach to planning that work. So rather than bog down the Sheridan Municipal Watershed analysis by including the prescribed fire, we moved quickly, authorized the timber and the thinning and the aspen restoration work, got that decision done in less than a year, and are moving to implement it while we do the harder work, which is planning burns in that complex landscape, which in time will, in time will resolve some of this lingering risk, particularly in the north part of the project. And so, lastly, what are those lessons learned? For us, it's that we need the diversity of a project area, the diversity of a challenge directly relates to the diversity of the team you need to assemble to address it. And for us, that was bringing as many partners as we could to the table to fill in the gaps in our skill set and our knowledge base. So we scale up. Those interagency and community partnerships are absolutely critical. And those partnerships need to come from the start, from before we get to the NEPA analysis. It's from the assessing what the actual risk and challenges on the landscape. Start there. And then, leverage each one of those individual partners' skills and what they bring to the table. For the Wyoming Water Development Office, that was money that could fund those hazard assessments that we were unable to do. For, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, it's funding some of the non-traditional work like building beaver dam analogs. And then we also have used the NRCS Forest Service Joint Chiefs Program to fund most of the implementation of the Buffalo Municipal Watershed. Again, something we would not be able to do without those partners at the table. And then we have to make those hard trade-offs about, could we treat all of the roadless? We couldn't, but we could treat enough of it that would make a meaningful difference and only leave a small amount of residual risk on the landscape. And then trying to balance that need to not treat all of the acres that we potentially could have, because that in and of itself would increase that risk of sedimentation that we were trying to avoid. And then continue to work through those challenges of roadless. So again, 2 relatively small projects, but projects that were really targeted towards a critical need on the landscape and that were done quickly and effectively, I think. So there you go. Questions? Yes.
Thank you. That was a really, really great presentation. So I'm Christina Burry with Denver Water. For those conversations, when you're thinking about the 3 steps, the risk assessment, then the prioritization, and then the mapping, for that mapping exercise, talking about what's accessible, what's not, what's steep, who on the National Forest is part of those conversations? And the reason I ask is did you use pods? Did you bring in the fire folks? Did you bring in the hydrologist? Did you bring in the timber manager? Were they all in the same room? And how do those conversations happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So First about pods. Do we use pods? No, this was before that the pods conversation reached the Bighorn. We're doing that work now. But so who was in the room? I would say it wasn't just the Forest Service. It was, yes, our fire and fuels folks. Yes, our timber folks, wildlife in particular. A lot of these treatments are also something I didn't mention, targeted around ensuring that we retain enough elk security habitat. And then our partners, the key partners that have that expertise. So hydrologists from the Wyoming Water Development Office, partners in game and fish, partners in state forestry. Because how we've implemented these is the whole suite of tools that other folks have mentioned today. It's Good Neighbor Authority, it's state timber sales, our own timber sales. But so in those initial risk trade-off conversations, it is that the bigger group from the different partners. So where we can, where the fire and fuels folks from the Forest Service might target wanting to treat certain stands, but those trade-off, they're going to be trade-offs to wildlife habitat that game and fish is bringing up, to sediment risk that our hydrologists are bringing up. So it's the mix, and from the beginning, at the table from the start, not us going to them with a proposal. We developed a proposal together.
This might be a hard one to answer, but I really liked about the information you brought about the Wyoming Water Development funded hazard assessments. Do you know what one of those would have cost? Or since they put up the funds, in Colorado, we see Forest of Faucets, we have our big water providers put up the 33 million when it goes water to Trans Mountain diversion. And in the Western slope, we're much more like Wyoming, meaning our little municipal water providers don't have deep pockets to do that. So I'd love to find a department in Colorado, state level, that would help fund some of those risk assessments. I talked to Jamie with our wildfire local regional guys. They don't have the capacity. So it's finding that gap that we're missing, I think, on the Western slope was my first question. And I've already forgotten my second question. So that's enough for me.
Well, I'll answer the first one while you think about what the second one was. So if I recall, they were roughly around $500,000 each, about 500,000. On the first, that funding was exclusively from the Wyoming Water Development Office with the support of the governor's office. On the second one, the state legislature didn't allocate those funds. And so it was funded by a mix of existing funds the Wyoming Water Development Office already had, and then funds from us and from Sheridan County. But both were roughly around 500,000. And like I said, they were contracted out. They were done by the Anchor Point Group from here in Colorado in Boulder, Respect, which is a company in Missoula, and HDR out of Rapid City, South Dakota, each one bringing a certain skill set to the table, but Anchor Point was the prime contractor for those. And, one thing that's important to me, and some of you probably recognize, is that contracting with the Forest Service is not an easy thing to do for us. It's painful, it's long, it's expensive. It doesn't make sense for us to award that contract. It makes sense for the state to do that. So we provide the funds, our share of the funds into an agreement, and those contracts are advertised and awarded by the state of Wyoming. We're doing the exact same thing right now on a forest-wide integrated weed management EIS it's funded by our contract with a third-party contractor awarded by the Wyoming Department of Agriculture.
Hi, Cindy Dozier, Executive Committee Club 20. You win the award for the fastest talking, most intense information sending out person I have seen today. I feel like I just got blasted with a fire hose from you. So much good information.
I'm a New Yorker. I apologize.
My question involves something that we experience here in Colorado, and perhaps where you are, it's a little bit different. And that is, how do you achieve public support / social license to do I think you said a 10,000 acre prescribed burn, didn't you say that?
We're looking to, yeah.
And how did you achieve social license to do that? That's impressive.
Yeah, so social license can be a tricky thing. It's when you have it, it's great, but it's easy to lose. And it's something that, in my opinion, is based on trust, and it's based on past experience. It's also based on fear. And so we have, one of the things that when I came to the Bighorn roughly 5 years ago, impressed me immediately is how strong of relationships the forest had with its counties, in particular with the county commissions. The forest is spread across 4 counties: Sheridan, Johnson on the east side, Bighorn and Washakie counties in the west. And all 4 of those sets of county commissioners worked very, very closely with the forest, and we're good supporters of the work we have going on. And that's based on continuous engagement with each other. And so we have used and leveraged that relationship to build social license or support in the communities for the work that we need to do, even when that work isn't necessarily what people in the communities are comfortable with or necessarily even happy about. If we are communicating that need in lockstep with our counties, with state forestry, with game and fish, and with some of our local partners like the local chapter of RMEF or backcountry hunters and anglers, groups like that, we find that we're more successful. These are communities too that are very comfortable and supportive of timber harvest in general. They recognize its value. They recognize what it does, with the value of that as a tool to manage the landscape. So we experience support for that. However, these are communities that are wary of wildfire. Like I mentioned, the Bighorn doesn't see a lot of wildfire. Average fire size is 10 to 12,000 acres. So smoke in the sky can be concerning for folks, but we have a good track record of success with those burns. But again, that circling back to that reason why the Sheridan Municipal Watershed decision didn't include prescribed fire is because those burns are complicated. Those burns are big, and they're not something our communities, I would say, are ready for. So we're taking a little bit more time. So that decision was more intensive on the mechanical treatments to reduce risk now while we do the harder work. And so we are actively engaging with our communities and sort of publicizing the recent successes we've had with prescribed fire, as well as one of the photos up there was of the Crater Ridge wildfire that burned on the north part of the forest for 2 months this summer, but burned for 2 months without generating any risk to private lands, didn't destroy any privately owned structures. It burned down an old cabin of ours that was a good thing that it went away. It was a rat infested dump. So it solved a problem in my mind. But we also, kind of leveraged living with the smoke from that fire and the benefits that was having on the landscape as part of this conversation. So we know that there is concern, there's risk, but there's also positive benefits that come out of it. Game and Fish is mirroring that one of their talking points around the Crater Ridge wildfire was how excited they were for the beneficial habitat effects for elk. And that those units would be good ones to put in a tag for it. If you want to know what they are, I'll tell you later.
Okay. We're going to go 1, 2, 3. I'm going to let Chris.
Thanks, Ray. Andrew, echo others' compliments on your presentation. Really good and even more importantly, encouraging information. Thank you. You started out and had a slide that the purpose, the theme was an improvement of water quality. That was the primary purpose. And I'm wondering, was that improving water quality baseline conditions, or improving water, or ensuring that water quality wasn't ruined by wildfire? And then allied question on the other side of the equation, was water quantity any part of the goals, and what were the metrics for measuring success for water quality and water quantity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't remember where that was in there, but so yes, one of those primary purposes was to enhance water quality. And I would say, while not named, also to improve water quantity, or at least retain it. And so both concepts were throughout the planning, on people's minds throughout the planning process. And so in that regard, these weren't just about generating timber. They weren't just about reducing fuels. That's why you see the aspen enhancement work, the beaver dam analog work, and some of the burns, I didn't mention this moving through it, but some of the prescribed burns that we're doing through the Buffalo Municipal Watershed Project aren't targeted at fuels reduction. They're targeted at improving stand conditions in sagebrush. In sage, where we have similar terminology to timber stands, we have a lot of acres of sagebrush that its canopy cover, density and diversity of age structure is out of alignment with where it should be. The same sort of conversation we have around timber stands. And so we wanted to use fire to break up the continuity of those sagebrush, that sagebrush ecosystem, punch some holes in it basically, and allow for some more grass informed development, which, can benefit our livestock producers. It also benefits wildlife. And so, and at the same time, reduces the risk of those all burning off at the same time in a large wildfire, which would increase sedimentation and, have challenges for water quality. So, the water quality and water quantity component were intermixed. What specific actions were included around water quantity? That's a tougher one for me to answer. Like I said, I'm not a hydrologist, though. A good part of our focus was treatments around the catchment basins for those storage reservoirs, so that should portions of those burn, sedimentation didn't reduce the ability of them to store water, and sort of kept up the output that the landscape generates right now.
Thank you. Thank you. On the water quantity question, I'm curious, you mentioned that some of the burning happened in lodgepole stands and you avoided north-facing slopes. Was any of that because of snowpack capture and retention? Because I'm just curious about the research, because the research we're digging into, like the closest water quantity benefits we're finding are in stand management to influence snowpack management. I wonder if that was part of the planning.
The snowpack component was about containing the fire with minimal investment in, very steep country. So we can't treat it mechanically. So we can't build fire line, for example, with mechanical fuel break. It would have to be done by hand, which is time consuming and expensive. And so burning the south facing slopes when the north facing slopes have snow on them solves that containment problem for us. Okay. Also, just the way that the landscape is laid out in that Buffalo Municipal Watershed area, and as those slopes flow down to their intake point, the timber cover on those north-facing slopes is pretty integral towards, preventing lots of sediment from flowing into the creeks. And so again, we're targeting those south-facing slopes to prevent the likely path of a wildfire based on historic fires on that landscape. The way fire is going to move with prevailing winds, with fuel loading and alignment, those critical slopes to treat are the south-facing ones to slow or even stop a fire from spreading onto the north-facing slopes, which would have that catastrophic effect.
Wendell Kuntz, Delta County Commissioner. First of all, thanks for recognizing RMEF and the volunteers. I'm a member, and our dues and our fundraising go to projects just like that. And there's a lot of other organizations like Wild Turkey Foundation that put a lot of effort into doing that. So thank you for that. You mentioned a couple of times in your presentation, there's a 15% rule of thumb for treatment areas. Is that annually, biannually? Because we heard earlier this morning, you've got to treat about 40% of the fuel load to make a significant change. Thanks.
Yeah, great question that I don't know the answer to. When we're done, I'm going to dive into that stack of paper and find it for you.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm Sonia Chavez of the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District. I was really pleased to see you using beaver dam analogs across your landscape to address wildfire, put natural breaks, kind of re-wet that sponge. The Upper Gunnison District is running a wet meadows restoration and resiliency program, and I know Wyoming and Montana use a lot of that as well, but it is one of the ways in which we are hoping to improve water quantity. So if you can re-wet the sponge, hold that snowpack there, and then slowly release it, we think there's going to be long-term benefits to our watershed. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Part of what I was saying earlier is about, generating social license and interest in the work. And sometimes we have our communities, maybe it's because of a level of trust, who knows why, we don't get a lot of comments, for example, on a project. And so, but we know we need community engagement and community support for some of this work. We didn't anticipate it, but the beaver dam analog work seemed to really captivate our communities in their interest. They were curious about it. That these were volunteer projects. So as the 4 that we've done so far in the Buffalo watershed moved along, each one, more and more people showed up. And in particularly the one when our public affairs officer showed pictures of the baby beavers that were going to get released and by Game and Fish, all of a sudden, I think every kid in Johnson and Sheridan County wanted to be there for fuzzy little baby beavers. But, we have beavers in the landscape. We needed more. So that was part of that project, was introducing those. But, that wet meadow ecosystem on the Bighorns is critical to the forest. And so, we have this work going on. Some of the other stuff we do is a variety of exclusions. We have a really, really wonderful and healthy moose population, probably too many. And so moose impacts of riparian areas is pretty high. And so we've got a variety of work going with Game and Fish to figure out the right sort of exclosures. We already are really good at excluding cattle from where we need to from sensitive riparian areas and some of those wet meadow ecosystems, but keeping the moose out's another whole other challenge. But our employees call it the elephant proof fencing. It's pretty impressive what you have to build to keep a moose out, but it's working.
More questions?
That was a good presentation. I'm Tim Kylo. I'm the resource forester for Montrose Forest Products here in Montrose, Colorado. I was pleased to see that in your watershed treatment, you were able to actually access roadless to a certain degree. And we're facing the same issues in Colorado. Much of our high country, our peaks and everything are roadless areas. I'm wondering if it's now not the time to start looking at a weighted average. What's more important, a healthy watershed, a fireproof watershed, if we can create that, a watershed that isn't dying from beetles, or looking at roadless and saying, well, maybe we could put a little bit more roads in here and protect ourselves for a century going forward. What are your thoughts? I know that's a legislative issue, but is there any dialogue between, say, your forest and your reps in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we've had a long running dialogue going, which Jim knows a lot about. And a number of years ago, prior Wyoming Governor Matt Mead, based on he had what he called the Task Force on Forests, looking at Wyoming forest conditions and needs for change out on the landscape. One of those was recognized was the roadless challenge that the Bighorn has, with 50+% of our landscape in roadless. And interestingly, the way the inventory of roadless was done on the Bighorn has some oddities to it. We have 380 miles of open year-long road in inventoried roadless area. So we have some quirks with our roadless, and that was identified as a challenge, as well as just the volume when there is a need to protect some of these landscapes. So a roadless collaborative was formed, did a lot of work sensing with communities, assessing the issues out there in the landscape, and came up with a suite of recommendations for either a Wyoming roadless rule along the lines of what Colorado has, or even a Bighorn specific roadless rule. The political capital to pull off either was more than I think that was available at the time. But what's important to me is that task force or that collaborative group, which had broad-based membership from the environmental community, the Wyoming Wilderness Association, for example, to the timber industry, all aspects of interest groups were involved, came to broad-based consensus on a couple key recommendations, one of which was an additional exemption to the roadless rule for targeted treatments in municipal watersheds, which we don't have. We can do some fuels work, but there were really targeted recommendations that I think would help us touch more of those landscapes while still preserving their roadless characteristics and roadless qualities, moving down the road.
My name's Harry Perulis. We're in the ranching business, and we ranch in both Colorado and Wyoming. I'd like to shirt tail the question that was asked about the contributions that are made from the state of Wyoming in your collaborative projects and the funding. Could you speak to the fact that Wyoming, for a number of years, although it's off now, collected just under $1 billion a year in severance taxes, and that funding was so available and so able to use for these kind of projects that it really put Wyoming over the top. And I think that the Colorado could learn from that, because we learn what the difference in ranching in Wyoming versus ranching in Colorado. We have a demographic difference. And I think that there might be an awareness there that Colorado could learn from Wyoming as just to how valuable those severance taxes are.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, so while those severance taxes themselves is not a topic I'm all that familiar with, what I can say is that we do have good collaborative working relationships with stock growers and wool growers. There are both cattle and sheep get grazed on the Bighorn, and we see the relationship with them as integral towards meeting our objectives in the landscape. And so do our state partners, whether it's the Wyoming Department of Ag or Game and Fish. And as we try to work to balance cattle and sheep grazing for those producers with providing high quality elk and moose habitat, as well as bighorn sheep. You know, we have bighorn sheep on the Bighorns, obviously with their name, not as many as you would hope for a forest named the Bighorn, but we have them. Bighorn sheep and domestic sheep is a hot button issue in a lot of places. It isn't for us. We have a good healthy balance there, and that's because of the good effective relationships with the producers who value those bighorn on the landscape as well.
Let's give him a big hand, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.